welcome everybody to what's going to be a great In Conversation. I'm Roger Osborne. I'm an associate professor at James Cook University, the Roderick Associate Professor of English Literature here, and a member of the Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing. Alongside, I can see my colleague, Associate Professor Victoria Katainen, also in the room, who's joining us here. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Irriganji people on whose land I'm sitting at the moment. So I'm here in, you can see this picture, I'm in Cairns at the Smithfield campus, which has the name Noma Bada, meaning place for tomorrow's learning, knowledge, and wisdom. And I always like to put that one out there because it's at moments like these that we acknowledge the first peoples of all of the lands that we're occupying, and to remember that there's been stories and storytelling in these places for a long time before many of us have arrived here. JCU acknowledges First Peoples of all of the world, their rich cultures and their knowledge of the natural environment. And so we pay particular respect to Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the traditional custodians of the lands and waters of Australia. JCU's pledged to achieve genuine and sustainable reconciliation between the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the wider community. And it's moments like these when we come together to have these sorts of conversations that I feel like we're working towards those ends. Welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this in conversation. It's come about through a visit to JCU and the Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing from Dr. Rose Michael from RMIT. It's been a pleasure to have Rose here for her time in Cairns, but now also her time in Townsville. I'm going to let Rose introduce herself and Bonny. It's going to become quite an introduction in there in conversation. We'll get to know them more, I think, than me giving you the potted biography of them. But before I do that, I just wanted to say a little bit about the Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing. It's very new. It comes from a bequest from Colin and Margaret Roderick. Colin Roderick was the foundation chair of English literature at James Cook University, and along with Margaret Roderick, they have left a significant amount of money to support the study of Australian literature and the fostering of creative writing. So, in essence, the mission of the Roderick Centre is to follow that call to foster the reading and writing of Australian literature in all its forms and to encourage the study of the broad field of Australian literature and literary cultures. As I've said, when we come together and have these sorts of conversations, that's what we're able to do. So for the proceedings today, I'm going to invite Rose and Bonny to begin their conversation in just a minute. I'm going to monitor the chat, so if you have any questions just throughout the conversation, you can put them into the chat and I can pass them on to Rose and Bonny at the appropriate time. When we get towards the end, we can have some discussion and some questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions at that time. I'll just let you know that this session is being recorded. And at some time in the future, we will be able to share it to those people who haven't been able to be with us. There's been a broad interest in this conversation from many places within Australia, but as far away as Ireland. So there is international interest in what we're about to hear. So without further ado, I would like to invite Rose to begin her conversation with Bonny Cassidy.
Thanks so much, Roger. And I would also like to start by acknowledging the country on which I am a guest today, as well as traditional owners where RMIT conducts its business throughout this land and waters. And I'd encourage anyone to also write on the chat the countries that they're coming from to acknowledge that this is unceded land and stolen country. So here today I am having a conversation with Bonny Cassidy, who is a peer and colleague of mine at RMIT, and we recognise lots of the names in the room. So, you know, feel free to put your camera on, feel free to put your hand up or jump on the chat. I'd like to thank, you know, Roger, Victoria, Elizabeth, everybody who's welcomed me to Cairns and Townsville on behalf of the Roderick Centre and the fellowship. And it just was a great opportunity for me to have a conversation with Bonny about her book that I've been wanting to have with her, to kind of dig a little bit deeper into some of the questions that it's thrown up for me, and to sort of do it in a setting that also gives her a chance perhaps to share some of the insights into the process and the practice that resulted in the book for other people who might be interested. So on the chat, Tennille has posted a link to Monument, which is Bonny's latest book. It's I was going to say, you know, it's a non-fiction. Is it an essay collection? Is it a poetic work? We will sort of dig into all of that. But definitely from my point of view as a reader, it's a bit of a departure from the previous books of poetry that I had read of Bonny's. And it threw up a lot of questions that were really interesting to me as somebody who specialises in speculative fiction, but more and more leans towards the idea of all writing as speculative. So while it might seem that Bonny and I don't necessarily have a lot of overlap in terms of our creative practice, I think what we're sort of here to talk about today, or I suspect what might be thrown up, is more common ground than you would think. But perhaps I'm wrong. So I thought I would just actually start by asking Bonny to introduce herself and to prompt it with this question, where I was thinking a little bit about Vivian Gornick talking about the situation and the story, the situation being kind of the bare bones, whether they were facts or nonfiction, and the story being kind of the narrative or the through line. And I just thought for anyone here who hasn't read Monument, perhaps Bonny, you might introduce yourself, but also introduce the book as context for our conversation.
Thanks, Rose, and thank you, Roger and Victoria. I'm zooming in from Dja Country in central Victoria, and proud to be a guest of a very strong community, particularly within the current treaty negotiations in Victoria, and a strong community in settlement with the state of Victoria. Thanks, Rose. I think that my bio, my kind of formal bio, was on the, you know, the event information. And as Rose mentioned, there's a number of people here who probably are familiar with aspects of my work. So I'll just talk very kind of broadly about my career, such as it is so far anyway. And then Rose, I'll move into your point about situation and story. So maybe working backwards, in a strange coincidence, I'm now studying psychological science at JCU remotely. I've never been to the campus or the campi, which Rose has, and so this event is quite a lovely connection of my two sort of fields now, I suppose, being one in sciences and one more established in humanities as a creative writing and literary studies and cultural studies academic for the last 15 or 20 years, including 10 of those at RMIT, which I share with Rose. And before, during, and after that, as a creative author who has published 3 books of poetry, and then Monument, which is, as Rose said, it's catalogued as memoir, as literary memoir, therefore as nonfiction, but it does contain what would, you know, visually be recognised as enjambed lines of poetry, as well as, I guess, some prose that moves between both the speculative and the kind of personal essay and the sketch to something perhaps more akin to informal historiography and reportage. So to pick up your question about situation and story in relation to the book, I know that there might be some people joining us who aren't from the humanities. I'm not sure what the kind of breakdown of our group is today. So Rose and I thought we might talk more about speculation, in research rather than in writing craft exclusively. So I'm going to try and sort of stick to that focus. But I think craft will come up. And in thinking about situation and story, you can kind of approach that from either way. You could think about situation as being, what we might broadly call, I suppose, content, and then story being the craft that carries that along, if we were going to talk about it from, more centrally a creative writing perspective. But I think there's another way of thinking about situation in story, and I suppose I can't help but bring in my psychology sort of frameworks here and think more about, situation and story as a kind of psychotechnology that is very special to human beings. It's our ability to appraise the world in front of us, and then make decisions about what is happening and how we're going to walk into it. So if I took that description of situation and story and applied it to monument, I guess what I did try to do with this book is look at the historical material that I gathered as a researcher, and then decide how, as a writer, I would walk into that with craft. But I also was thinking about how I would make sense, make a story, make a grammar, make a sentence out of that historical material that would help me as a human being to make sense of what I was looking at. And that's, I suppose, where where the aspects of memoir and where the aspects of personal essay come in, is the book as an attempt to walk through the factual information and line it up. It is a fragmentary book in its form, and maybe we could talk about that a little bit more around the idea of flaws in speculation and gaps in speculation. What do you think, Rose? Does that answer the question?
It makes me laugh because I'm jotting down all these other questions, and I warned you that I'm inclined to go off script, and I have yet to say anything that's on my script, and this may be how we proceed. But the prompt that instantly comes up when you talk about that, from my point of view, that emphasis on process and speculation as a process and as a practice, rather than as a sort of an output, kind of description of genre or form, is this sense that I get when I'm reading your book, which I find so delightful, where you return to scenes or facts or encounters and you retell them, you try it on, from a different point of view. And I'd like to ask you a question out of that, which is around, truth, aware of how open that is to interpretation. But I'm thinking of what Helen Garner writes at the beginning. I think it's of This House of Grief, where she talks about looking at something in a diary that she remembers saying, like the last line in a conversation or something. And when she goes back to her diary, she did not say it. And so she sort of talks about the court in this instance as something that is grounded on, and to go back to what you said about us as sort of story-making machines, that it's grounded on being able to tell your truth, a truth, and yet to have this documentary evidence, as Helen Garner talks about, that what she thinks she remembers, what she knows is not what happened. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about, or tell us a little bit about, sorry, no, you're only talking to me, about an instance in your research, a scene in the book where you wrote it to understand it, to process it, to find that line through, and then came back to it and wrote it another way, wrote it again, rewrote it.
Yeah. I will. As you were talking, I was thinking in response to that Garner reflection that we can talk about knowledge transmission. We can talk about corroborated truth and consensus around truth as being complemented by speculation, I think, in such a way that both can work together. The one instance in the book, there's many that I can think of that kind of illustrate what you're describing, but I'll pick out one, and I might, if it's okay, just read it. It is a bit of the versified part of the book, so it's actually quite short, and maybe just hearing it first will help me explain it as an attempt to walk into the possible way things were, and then to maybe reappraise or adjust that through the act of writing. And I will just add a content warning to this for any First Nations people in the audience. It does refer to colonial racial violence, and it does refer to old people who have passed. A far-travelling echo reaches me from the house under the hill at Risdon Cove. As soon as I try to recall it, though, the story refracts and squirms. It goes, she pours coals onto the black feet and watches the skin appear. No, she appears before a pair of black feet. They turn towards her. A pair of blackened feet runs away. Or a pair of feet appears behind and she casts the coals. She doesn't look back as she runs. White coals left to blacken in the hearth. So the situation that I started with there was a piece of oral history from my family about this encounter at the house at Risdon Cove, which features in the book, in Lutruwita, Tasmania. And there's a couple of reasons why I wrote it as a sequence or a series of versions. One is that the details of the original telling were vague enough that they could have occurred in a number of different sequences. That was when I first received, that story as a child, but as a researcher coming back to it when writing the book at this stage of my life, I had other questions for the story that weren't just about what happened in what order. I also had questions about how did this scene even come to be? How were these two figures? Why were they encountering one another? And therefore, how could that situation explain how the story might have gone? So there's 3 versions of the encounter in that poem, and I don't have the final. There isn't a final version of it. The final version is the kind of triplicate or the rewritten version that appears in the book. As the book goes on, I do try to pursue that situation and come back to it as a history later on and think about it through the lens of history writing that's been done around Black Wars in Lutruwita, and bring that historiographical perspective and research to the versions of the story. And that provides some clarity, but it does still remain speculative what exactly is going on and why.
One of the things I'd like to ask about that scene is, and I guess this is just informed by my sort of book selling and trade publishing background, I understand it completely as a fellow creative practice researcher. I wonder how it's received for a reader or for a family member, and how these, really kind of creative, experimental, expansive, sort of unresolved practices, how they kind of land for someone who's not in the habit of engaging in those ways? How do your family, who might have also feel that they have a relationship to this oral tradition, to this oral story, or someone with, you know, some knowledge about it from a different point of view, whether it's sort of in the archives or in the community, how's it received there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, appropriately, there's no one answer to that either. The main kind of transmitter of this encounter, this story, and other ones associated with the house at Risdon Cove is my mother. And when I was writing this, I did talk to I tried to corroborate her version with her a couple of times, and she wrote it down for me as well as me kind of recalling the oral version that she'd told. So I ended up with two, and of course, as I mentioned, another point in the book, there's a discrepancy between her written version and the oral version she told me as a child as well. So it's interesting that even in her act of writing, her sense of the logic of the story changed a little bit too. I have been surprised surprised and delighted that I guess my purpose across the whole book to go into these stories that I've received from other people in my family has, you know, they have been received with a sense of curiosity and in good faith with what my purpose has been in the book. I suppose my intention in that scene, as with other scenes in the book, is to always attribute who told me first in the book. So I'm clear earlier in the book that story comes from my mother, and I mention what happens when she writes the story down later on. So that's important to me, that she's acknowledged as the source of the information. But I think it's also, in saying that, it's reminding the reader too that it's a kind of, you know, it's a sort of whisper that I've received as well. And so what comes through the book is you know, a whisper that's kind of third hand by the stage it's written and read. Probably there's also some family members that didn't know that story and were surprised that, you know, again, not the only one they were surprised about, but surprised about that one, and sort of, you know, shared my sense of wanting to historically understand how it came about and what was going on. But I think actually the most surprising responses have been from complete strangers. I've received a lot of letters in email form from readers. I mean, I'm not talking about that scene in particular, but definitely some people who share colonial and non-Indigenous Lutruwita family history, and for whom that kind of scene is not unfamiliar from their own, you know, family oral histories. And I think readers who I don't think would ever have written to me about my collections of poetry, but for some reason feel comfortable, not only with the content, with the situation of the colonial history in the book, but seem to be perhaps a little bit more comfortable encountering the poetic form, such as in that scene, within the covers of a book that is framed as nonfiction. And I've been sort of puzzling over this for a while. Why is it that so many people would get in touch who are not, perhaps not readers of my previous, you know, books, my collections of poetry, not people I've encountered, you know, and people who read my books of poetry are other poets, including many people here. And the people writing to me about Monument are not poets. And yet they're reading the poetry in the book. And I asked our mutual colleague Ronnie Scott what he thought about this, and he said, "Oh, people feel they own nonfiction. Readers feel that they are they have agency in nonfiction simply by it being described as such, that they are invited by the genre to feel that they have skin in the game in nonfiction, whether or not they relate to the content personally." The labeling of the work as nonfiction tells them it's kind of a relaxation that they might have into whatever form they encounter in the book. Anyway, that's a theory.
That's interesting.
Perhaps not a relaxation they'd feel around poetry.
I wanted to say something in response to that, but first I'll just say I'll plant the seeds of my next question, which I think relates perfectly, which is about how central are you in this story, which I think goes back, the publisher in me says, this is why people write, is they feel like they know you and your relationship to the nonfiction, and then they can have their own relationship to the nonfiction also, and you've got this sort of triangular relationship. But I just wanted to just quickly make a comment, which I had not thought of when I was reading the book, or even when I was sort of designing this conversation as about speculative methods and this idea of speculative memoir or speculative fabulation. But I was suddenly thinking about, you know, the established genre of alternate history, which doesn't usually necessarily run 2 or 3 alternate histories. You know, the genre is often just an alternate history, like where the Americans didn't land on the moon or whatever. Although there's this amazing book called The Heavens by Newman, Sarah, I can't remember, where she keeps going back in time, and every time she goes back in time, it's worse. It's a worse alternate history, which is just an amazing book. But I was just thinking about this poetic speculation as multiple alternate histories, and then us sort of doing that act of cognitive dissonance of holding them all, and that perhaps then becomes a closer reflection to the sort of the reality of our own relationships to history, which is fraught and contested and often not corroborated, to use your word, or not corroborated consistently. But so back to that question, which perhaps leads on from people writing to you, how central would you say you are in this work? And I guess I'm not asking as an author where you're the driver and you have this desire and this process, but I'm thinking more of the reader coming to the book and how they might describe this story. How central do you think is the figure of this narrator, this memoirist, this essayist, this Bonny Cassidy?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that it's a particular, or I think peculiar was the word that Bruce Pascoe used. It's peculiar history in the sense that it's peculiar, it's particular to my family, and therefore me as an individual, as a self, the continuity of the name on the cover with the first person voice that's narrating it is important in terms of adding to the factual kind of proposition that the book makes. However, the fundamental reason I decided to write the work was because I felt that in some ways I am, and a number of the family members and encounters in the book are, and this in no way renders their peculiarity null, but they are non-Indigenous colonial every people in some sense as well. And while my narrating voice certainly, you know, brings my own perspective to whatever it's narrating, my real interest in bringing myself into this work was to demonstrate that the questions I'm asking and a lot of the situations I'm encountering in the research are typical of a particular cultural and ethnic non-Indigenous colonial background. And I had known that for a long time through conversations, through years of reading, that this was the case, that the history is not so peculiar that it's extraordinary. I actually think that it's quite ordinary, by which I mean it can be expanded. The situations or the stories in it can be expanded, to a kind of complex of scenarios happening, particularly across southeastern Australia over the duration of time that the book covers, which is, roughly 150 years.
That makes me think of that sort of Leslie Jamison quote of like leaning into the specificity, like the more specific you can get, you can sort of push through into a universal in that everyman sort of language that you used. I wonder, I'm sort of stepping outside the constraints of the book slightly here, but I wonder whether this background, this story, this family history leads to these academic, scholarly, creative interests, or these kind of academic, scholarly, political, philosophical, psychological interests lead you to kind of identify and write about this family history. Is there a shift one way or the other? There might not be, but
I don't think without an educated sense of the problem of Australian history, I would have seen that ordinary significance in the peculiar and the personal stories. I think I would have found them curious in themselves, but I think without the scholarly and and autodidactic education in the broader cultural and critical and political and philosophical problems of history as a citizen and history telling, I would have pursued the work. So I suppose one requires the other, but a number of nearly all of the familial anecdotes or stories in this book I first heard before I had embarked upon that kind of education or career. Most of them I heard as a child. So I certainly was clearly they had an affect on me before I had that kind of more that more critical view of what their situation might have been indicating. So I'm not quite sure if I could sort of answer your question with a percentage.
no, I think
percentile. But I think that it's one kind of direction of interest or another that kind of drove the work. I think it's a combination of both, but over a long time. Yeah.
I think one of the things I love so much about this book and why I was just so keen to kind of have this conversation in a kind of public or a broader sort of setting is that I find it really hopeful as a way of engaging with stories that are so kind of complex, unresolved, that we are unsure of our relationship to them and therefore might be quite easy to kind of steer away from. And I know when we were sort of writing the little blurb for this session, I was thinking of Donna Harraway talking about speculative fabulations and a new mode of storytelling. And she particularly talks about it as a mode of attention, rather than kind of creating and kind of authority. And I think that there's something about your book that makes it very accessible, that people could do it. And I really sort of, I thank you for that. I think on behalf of readers, it's not a sort of a perfectly hermeneutically sealed thing over there that's brilliant, and yet we still kind of can't come at the complexities of our own stories. So to sort of bring it a little bit kind of closer towards the practice of the craft, and also just to invite people to start to think if they'd like to add any kind of questions on the chat that we might sort of come towards. Now would be a good time to be typing. But I was thinking in the Readings website, they've got a review, and it's got this great line where it describes the book, and I interpret it as reading the book as well as a long night in the archives. And I think the reason I like this quote so much is it does sound like genre fiction. It sounds like, like some, YA fantasy kind of Oxford set, scholarly sort of, I'm trying to think of the example I'm thinking of, The Magician, I think. But it has those sort of speculative aspects. But then it also obviously is talking about the archive and the kind of how do we come at this kind of expansive, uncontainable, and while we might be overwhelmed by the information that's contained, we also know it's not comprehensive. And so I would like to ask you a little bit about the work that you did to keep that experience of your own coming at the archives to kind of mirror and keep that experience alive in the book, both for you, keeping it alive in the writing of it, but also for us kind of engaging with it. So what are some of the ways in which you tried to not sort of lock it all down and resolve it in kind of, give in to the kind of text telos in that way, but to make it live with the frisson of a long night in the archives?
Well, that's a great question. The kind of macro structure, or the sort of optics of the book are a giveaway, I think, in a sense that it appears to be in pieces. It appears to be in mostly short bursts. And although they're organized into kind of constellations around place and time, there is a lot of movement between kind of, micro locations and settings within those kind of, if you like, chapters in the book. So I think structure was a way that I kept that that encounter with the archives alive to myself in the later drafting, but also wanted to retain for a reader, rather than what I did in earlier drafts, in fact, which was to create an overarching single narrative, and that was very fortunately was worked through with Ivor Indick and wonderful people at Giramondo. That was kind of inauthentic to the voice, to the purpose of the book. It was quite forced. I didn't even enjoy writing the kind of single master narrative version early on. So it felt sort of wrong when I was doing it, and it clearly didn't read well either. So I think that kind of that broader page to page structure, with there's visible ellipses in it, and there's restarts, and there's I use images as well, so the use of kind of photo image, and also some visual media of artworks is another way of punctuating the narrative, such that you could call it, sometimes it's an interruption, sometimes it's a non-verbal reflection. And I found, much like white space, which I'm accustomed to using as a kind of free verse poet, that I used again in kind of breaking up the micro sections of this book. Much like that, the visual images created this kind of non-verbal resonance, where I could perhaps allow a section to ripple or to echo. I'm aware both of those words occur early on in the book too, to the reader, to signal that perhaps sometimes to signal an ellipsis, but also sometimes perhaps to signal that the door to this room remains open, rather than closed. So I think those are kind of the macro structures that I decided to use to kind of keep that dynamic of the long night in the archives alive. But I think also there's another texture, which is about the tone of voice that I take to some accounts of the research process itself in the book. And they were few and important opportunities for me to bring humor into the book. I think in a book that is dealing with serious and often traumatic content, as well as, you know, kind of infinite questions of human motivation and suffering and error. It was really important to try and find opportunities for levity. And I think that the tone of the scenes where I was able to recount experiences in the archival research process itself ended up being kind of probably much more important than I realized when I was first writing them.
I was just thinking when you talked about images that also enables the reader to have their own direct experience, like you're kind of breaking that mediation. But that reminds me, you've got some images.
I do, yes. And I'll share these for what it's worth. I don't think they are essential. It's just kind of more something illustrative that I prepared recently for a guest lecture for some undergraduate students. And so I just thought that I'd include a couple of them here because they just, you know, expand a little bit on what we've been talking about so far, I think. And look, part of this guest lecture that I had given included formulating a list of the speculative research methods I'd used in the process of writing Monument. But I also realized that this is so, you know, this is entirely exegetical. This is entirely post hoc, this list. I certainly did not approach the book with this list pre-prepared. This is definitely something constructed in reflection, you know, much later. But I suppose when I tried to itemize all of the methods that I would call, you know, contributing to or involving speculation in the book, then this was it. And some of them I'd used in poetry before. Not all of them were initiated just for the purposes of Monument, but some of them were new to me. Interviewing, for example, wasn't something that I had used as a research method in my creative work before. I'd used it as a scholar in my PhD, but I had not used it as something to be rendered, you know, into reportage or into a kind of journalistic mode. So for what it's worth, that kind of, you know, quite formal list just sums up, I guess, other ways that the archival process of the book's composition became, you know, or was transmitted, how I transmitted it into the nature of the text. But yeah, also I had some images. I mean, I've obviously got lots of images from the research process, but since I already had these slides prepared, I thought I'd include them as well to illustrate some of those methods. And I think many people here would also use these sorts of methods of you know, of deep listening in place. And, you know, particular locations, research locations were obviously very important to this book. And a lot of its composition was done on the road, as it were, and was done, you know, in motion of travel. So I won't say look, unless someone wants to ask about these, I won't say particularly much about them. But they're really just to give a bit of a, I suppose, a bit of a visual collage of the sorts of things that were composting in the process of writing the book. Yeah, yeah.
I was going to ask you about the family trees because, and just to kind of repeat what I said before, I do think that including material in a book in various ways, whether it's actually poetry material you've created, but it enables the reader to shift in their relation to the text and perhaps to get out of a kind of a habit of novel reading or whatever their sort of habit is. So I was going to ask you how you came at the sort of redacted family trees, how you refer to them yourself, you know, whether they were sort of created or redacted, you know, like I sort of wondered which way you had sort of built them, and when was the point where you decided how they were going to sit on the page, you know, that sort of paratextual aspect, which, you know, suggests to the reader, here is the factual bit, and then here is the sort of textual kind of explicit
Yeah,
explication.
they went through many versions. This page here from one of my journal books from the research process features some of the early kind of more traditional tree structures. This is me actually mapping out for myself, you know, the who's who, just doing your classic kind of genealogical family tree. So they started in that kind of form. But then, and this is getting more into the craft kind of layer now. They then, you know, became almost a poetics of their own. I did really get into that process once I started rendering the text into type. So that, you know, that they did sort of take on almost a concrete kind of poetics. I started to think about the importance of what even glancing at a broken, you know, tree can communicate. They are there also as a, you know, as an attempt at an attempted navigational device. If you wanted to, you could use them to return and kind of you know, relocate a particular individual who's mentioned in the text, and specifically the trees always center me as the kind of, you know, the point that they're getting to, even if that's a blank, that's where they're leading. So it's just a way of saying to the reader, oh, in case there's a lot of names piling up here and a lot of locations and a lot of dates, they do work as a quick visual key. But as you've mentioned, they're also eroded and incomplete deliberately. And so I ended up with these quite sort of yeah, I mentioned sort of concrete poetry where some parts of the trees are actually composed just of vertical and horizontal lines without names. And then also some that have cul-de-sacs and certainly erasures. There was another layer to that kind of later typographical composition of them in that way too, which was I wanted to sort of make some ethical decisions about who I was comfortable to represent in those trees, and who I felt I didn't want to speak on behalf of in my immediate family. So there are some immediate family members who are not named and who might be indicated in some way visually in the tree, but who I felt weren't taking part in that kind of composition of the genealogical line, and therefore, you know, it seemed an opportunity for me to actually indicate once again to the reader that this is my telling, and yeah, so I think like lots of parts of the text, you know, ethics is kind of driving what's included and not. But the trees ended up being a lot of fun. They started off as a headache when I think I was thinking about them as something that needed to adhere to a traditional format, but ended up being something that yeah, increasingly broke down as the proofs and as the drafts became more and more refined.
It also just struck me as, you know, when you sort of go, when you look at, I don't know, who do you think you are or something like that, and you look at like birth records and, you know, those eras or those countries where the father has a profession and the mother doesn't, you know, and actually how those kinds of records, they say something in what's not said, and you're sort of taking that same logic and turning it and making it conscious what is unconscious or whatever. I'd love to open it to the floor if people wanted to ask a question on the mic. We're sort of all among friends here, and that would be great. But I'll just throw one more to you while people are sort of, I don't know, tidying their hair and getting ready to turn their mic on or put their virtual hand up or type something in the chat. I'm thinking about advice to other scholars, creative writers, people working with their own family histories, speculative, just beers in the world. I'm thinking about that James Baldwin quote where, you know, he's quite famous, or that he's quite famously quoted as saying, don't write what you know, write what you want to know. But the full quote is actually, write what you don't want to know, but something is making you sort of find out anyway. And I sort of wonder if off the back of that, you'd have sort of wisdom around what you think you want to do, what you don't think you want to do, what you found out that you didn't want to know, what you think was really driving it, or anything reflecting on your sort of initial motivations and where you feel now in response to both kind of the book as artifact, the writing of the book as a process, possibly even the talking about the book, and how that sort of ties back to the original, what you wanted to know or what you didn't want to know, but something drove you to know anyway.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a huge question, because it will continue to be answered over time. I think and anyone who's published a creative book will understand this feeling, I'm sure, which is that its meaning changes every time you as the author revisit it. And I'm not really talking about its kind of semantic meaning. Its place in your series of work, its origins, how it sits amongst the kind of trajectory of one's creative work. That changes every time I kind of reconsider it, whether it's through a conversation like this, or thinking about what I'm going to write next. What I am thinking of is a kind of counter quote to the Baldwin by the memoirist Maureen Murdoch, who says something like, basically in regards to memoir, her kind of, one of her maxims is let go of your agenda. That in the process, you're going to have to realize that the work will tell you what it's really about, and will continue to tell you what it's really about, and that will change. But certainly in regards to Monument, I started off with an idea of like a strong concept of its purpose. And in finding out through the research process things that I did and didn't want to know, of course, its conceptual purpose changed, and it took on its parameters broadened considerably. It became a much more philosophical work, and then it became a much more personal work. Much more, the kind of memoir aspect of it really stepped up about sort of 5 years, I think, into the near decade that it took to write it. So it kept kind of climbing out of itself. It kept sort of generating itself through the process of its being researched and composed, such that and again, I don't think this would be unfamiliar to many writers. I only really worked out what I was doing with it at proof stage, not because the text itself wasn't complete, but because only at that stage was I starting to be able to step away. And of course, when you step away, you can see the whole stage of the work, and you can start to appreciate the parts that certain details are playing, and how, it hangs it together or it doesn't, and what you're going to do about that. So I think it's probably only in the past 12 months. The book came out in February, and I probably completed it at about that time the year before. So it's really only within 12 to 18 months that I feel like I now really have a sense of how its agenda, my original agenda, fell away, and what came out of it, and why it is an artifact. You said the book as artifact, and that's exactly what it is. It is a thing in time. It is an abandoned project in that sense, not only because it's a creative work, but also as a memoir, of course. It's several of the stories in it are ongoing in lived reality.
Bonnie, I can just see we've got a couple of questions on the chat from Anne Carsons and Sophie Langley. Anne, did you want to ask Bonnie Did you want to jump on the mic, or Bonnie, can you scan the chat? I'm not sure if you're, you know, in your pajamas or.
I'm supine because I've had a hip replacement, so that's why I put chat. But hi, Bonnie, I really love your work. So layered and rich. And I was fascinated by you saying you'd had all of those email connects from people. And I was interested in drilling down a bit more into the composition of that, if you're willing to talk about it. For instance, I was really interested in whether people identified as Indigenous who contacted you and whether there was any sort of trend or uniformity in the content, you know, the feedback that they were giving, and also a sort of a totally different, what's the word, indice, but whether there were any cranks or people who were just a Ginyu project.
I think I probably thought that there might be, and I might have been probably overestimating the my own importance, really, to imagine that there would be cranks. No, there haven't been any trolls that I'm aware of, and certainly none that have contacted me directly. So that's good. But in terms of a pattern or a kind of demographic of people responding, no one's identified, not everybody's identified their cultural heritage or their ethnic identity. And I think I don't think there's a uniformity of views, but something that seems to recur in responses of kind of strangers who've read the book is the hopefulness that Rose mentioned. So that's been a surprise to me. I suppose having been immersed in the darker content of the book for so long, that's the note, that's the chord that was still resonating for me upon finishing it. And actually, that's not the note that was heard by the reader. There's a lighter note in there, or not lighter, but a more complex one that includes a possibility. And I think that's something that's been picked up by readers who've responded directly. Thank you for your question. Also, I love the word supine, and thank you for finding an opportunity to put it into a daily sentence, Anne.
Thanks, Bonnie.
There's a couple more questions on the chat, Bonnie, but I'm aware that we're sort of on time, so I'm not quite sure. Maybe Roger, you could let us know. Can Bonnie answer Sophie's question and possibly follow up?
There's nothing to stop us. So please just keep on going. I can see there's a few questions in the chat there, so feel free to continue.
Cool, thanks, Roger. Well, I'll just respond to them in turn, if that's okay. And then if anyone needs to leave because time's up, that I understand, of course. So Sophie, hello, lovely to see you and hear from you. Thanks for your question. So you're interested in macro structures and how I thought about collecting together the different smaller parts of the book and it being organized by time and place. So the main organizing structure evolved over time, so that the fragments also came quite late, as I mentioned. So yeah, the earlier organizing structure was a much more monolithic. It's not lost on me that it was a monumental structure originally. And I think probably that's when the strike through in the title probably first started to take its place. So breaking apart, going through a process of breaking apart an original attempt to make a linear logic, a linear story of the situation was a big step in the process of it. So I did consider, something that was less fragmentary earlier on. And then various iterations of that kind of chapter approach I tried as well, where I was trying to kind of separate the stories more until I realized that there was more to be said by kind of trying to play threads of them together, or even try to crisscross them, even if that was quite complex to follow or to indicate, than to try and separate them too neatly or too kind of artificially into regional histories. And then you ask, like, how do you finish off that organizing structure when the stories are ongoing? Yeah. Well, I think going back to the idea of abandonment of the creative work, thankfully a publisher with a deadline and particularly a close a close editor and a close kind of managing editor, really keeping things on track, and pushing proof stages through over and over and over and over. I think that for me was a great way to decide that the text as a document was coming to an end. I guess more conceptually finishing off an ongoing story, I tried to do that in the way that I framed the end of the book. Both the way that it appears, it does start to slow down and to spread out in the last pages, but also to try to close the book with an actual scene of a beginning and a scene of a return rather than a scene of closure. So I suppose conceptually that's how I went about that. Rose, do you think it's okay to crack on?
Nice to, I was just thinking, let's answer Victoria's question as well, because I know you've got contact with Angela, but Victoria's up here in Townsville. Yeah. So we've had 2 Melbourne, and Victoria's got this great question where she's talking about, she's mentioned people pushing themselves into new kinds of writing, but I think in your regard, we're sort of looking at this shift that has also brought something of the poet along. So Victoria said, I've been experiencing the challenge, rewards, growing pains, etc. of this herself. Could you talk through this part of the process, bringing your poet self, your academic writing self to the structure, or whether the new structure has brought something to these previous narrative registers selves? And perhaps that's a nice one to finish on as well, because I can't help but think it also speaks to this career transition and this sort of lovely straddling of the institutions of RMIT and JCU that has sort of brought this conversation together today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Victoria. It's a great question. Yeah, well, I feel you. I felt for a few years writing this, initially, I felt like an imposter, formally speaking. I felt like I was handling tools that as a poet, and this is very much a kind of self-narrative, sort of self-concept that I had, that I was not able to handle prose, which is ridiculous because I'd been writing other kinds of critical nonfiction for ages before I started writing the book and thinking about it as, a piece of creative nonfiction. So I was able to handle nonfiction prose, but I told myself that it was not my territory. And so I did have this kind of imposter syndrome with the form for a while. And then I started to feel less like an imposter and more like a baby, like really, like I just hadn't developed my kind of, my fine motor skills with prose yet. And so it felt very sort of clunky and like I was kind of throwing blocks at the wall, but I was doing something. And then I think it was reader feedback of really early drafts of the prose parts that began to make me stop and hear the prose. And I think that's where the poet self came in. And I realized that I already had a palette and I already had a sensibility that was able to hear, and including as a great reader of prose and of nonfiction prose, I could hear, what worked and what didn't. If I just listened to my own prose as I would my own poetry, and think about its rhythm and think about the clarity of an image, and think about what doesn't need to be said and what does. It was all there. I did have the capabilities there, but there was not silly, I shouldn't say that. There was an understandable, but probably an unnecessarily sustained sense that I didn't know what I was doing.
It also sounds like you sort of gave yourself what's that word? You gave yourself free rein, or to embrace the beginner's mind, So you can use that perspective not to make yourself stay in your lane, but to give yourself due humility to start something from a different point of view.
Yeah. Yes.
And that might be my cue to just jump in here and thank Rose and Bonny for a really good. I've got questions. I'm going to have to catch up with you two after some time. Just a question like being in the archive. I'll keep that one loaded for some other time, Bonny. But can I just ask everybody in whatever manner you do in these online situations to thank Rose and Bonny for a really good conversation. There is a reminder, this conversation is being recorded, so if you want to come back to it, those people who have had to leave a little bit early,